And we are back for our tour around the world. Let me just reset this here. Here we go. All right, so let's start in Africa where it all began. You can see there's a lot of variation within Africa. Actually, it's the most genetically diverse. If you want to break it down by continent, it's the most genetically diverse continent. So you can see, sort of different eye colors, different skin tones, different facial features. And if you're a fan of Where's Waldo, you can play Where's Mark in this video, because I show up in some of these pictures. As you can see over on the left there, I was fortunate to be able to go to Ghana when I had a job that paid me. And that was cool. So, then if we move up into Europe, you see we have a variety also of skin tones and facial features. There's this man sort of on the bottom in the center is from Georgia, which is sort of, in West Asia, really technically, but sometimes included as part of Europe. All the way to your pasty Irishman over here. But these handsome gentlemen there on the bottom left are actually my cousins in Ireland. So, less pasty for sure. I'm not the pastiest. And then we have a woman from Bulgaria over here and a few gentlemen from Italy. And I submit that if you couldn't look at clothes or hear the language that someone was speaking, you might not be able to differentiate people like from Southeastern Europe, for example, or Southern Europe from people from Western Asia, right? So you have on the left-hand side some individuals from Iran. And then on the right, you've actually got people from an ethnic group in China called the Uyghurs, who speak a Turkic language and are Muslims, but they reside within the modern nation state of China, right? And you can see where geographically Uyghurs generally tend to live within China, sort of almost in the center of the Eurasian landmass there. So again, you have a variety of sort of facial features, eye colors and whatnot. Then looking at in like modern day India, all of these individuals live within the boundaries of modern day India. And again, like the further south into like areas in the tropics and near the equator you get, the darker people's skin tone tends to get as well. And so you have a variety of skin tones even in India, and eye colors and facial features. Okay. Here, all of these people live in the modern nation of Thailand, representing sort of different ethnic groups, different backgrounds, different geographical regions of Thailand. And again, in the southern part of Thailand, where it's more in the tropics, you tend to get darker skin tones again, right? So people within this band tend to share similar skin tones, right? People along any really latitudinal kind of line across the globe tend to be more similar in skin tone. So in different parts of East and Southeastern Asia, you've got two guys from Japan over there. One is the top picture is of a man from the indigenous Ainu group, who are known for being quite hairy. I didn't make that up. That's a pretty rad beard. And then you have Ken Watanabe, a Japanese actor. And then you've got two individuals from the Philippines. So you've got one woman who was either Miss Universe or Miss Philippines. I don't remember now, from around, 2010, maybe 2012. And then a person from an ethnic group in the south of the Philippines who resembles people more from like Australia, Melanesia, Papua New Guinea. Speaking of which, these are folks from Papua New Guinea and Melanesia, and the blonde hair is actually a trait that's indigenous to the area. It's not the same allele that is found in Northern Europe, but it wasn't brought there by, say, like European colonialism. It's something that is native to the region. Then you have, the Americas, right? A variety of skin tones. Again, in the tropics, going to be darker. The further you get from the equator, it's going to be lighter. I think I spot Waldo in there again, baking some cupcakes. So just, that gives you an idea of just how diverse the world is, even within a particular continent or even within a particular country. So most people, again, tend to think of skin color when they talk about race, but that's one trait, right? Why don't we define race on the basis of blood groups? Oh, that would be interesting. This here, so I should go over these bullet points here. Your blood groups are your A, B, and O, but there are, because we are diploids, we have, one allele comes from our mother, one allele comes from our father. So you can have any combination of these A, B, and O alleles. So you could have AA or AO, and those together are the group of A blood type, BB or BO, and those together are B blood type, or OO, and that's the O blood type. So this first picture shows the frequency of the O blood type in different parts of the world. So it's actually the most frequent blood type, believe it or not. Over 60% of people in the world have type O blood. And what you're looking at here is the frequency of that. And so on this scale, it only goes from 50 to 60% as the lowest frequency to 90 to 100%. So people in populations throughout the globe have type O blood, right? So that puts us all in one racial group. But if you want to go by frequency, let's say all peoples who have no more than 60% type O blood are one racial group. Well, you'd have a racial group that includes people from Scandinavia, people from Bulgaria and Greece and Turkey and the Caucasus and parts of northern India and parts of East Asia and Siberia, and even some peoples from Australia and Papua New Guinea, right? If you just wanted to encapsulate people who have between 70 and 80% type O, you've got it looks like you've got Ireland, Scotland, a slice of Sweden, like Mongolia, parts of Africa, so it's all over the map. Now, if you compare this to skin color, it's a different picture, right? It's a totally different picture. Let me just go back and forth a few times, like we're having a light switch rave. It doesn't map on to these skin colors, right? Now, this is a map of the percentage of type A blood in different places, and you see like the highest frequencies are found in Australia, parts of northern Scandinavia, and parts of far North America, and these are indigenous groups. This doesn't take into account the movement of people over the last 500 years. These are people indigenous to these regions. And here's type B. I'm actually type B. Whoa, it's the rarest. Heyo. I'm type B. Even though my forebears come from Ireland, England, and Poland, where it's not super frequent, I'm still type B. Yeah, that's right. One thing you'll notice is the Americas tend to be fairly similar. So the percent of type B is real low in the Americas. For the most part, type A is real low, except for like a few hot spots. And going back to type O, huge portions of the Americas have between 90 and 100% type O. Now, why might that be? I can't hear you. It's probably because of founder effect. Because we know that the Americas were populated over the Bering Land Bridge from far northeastern Asia, like Siberia, and there were small groups that came over, right? And already the frequency of type O is it's fairly high. It's between 60 and 70%. If you had just randomly like a couple other people who happen to have type O in that group or those handful of groups that came over, because of small population sizes, you might end up eventually with large populations that have really high frequencies of that allele, right? Okay, so then we could also look at lactase persistence, so the ability to drink milk as an adult without suffering the consequences, so to speak. If you believe the data, most of humanity is lactose intolerant. So all of these areas with greens and blues, for example, have very low lactase persistence, which means they're mostly lactose intolerant. That's actually the original condition of humanity. I bring this up because it's kind of funny. There have been some things in the news over the last 5-10 years or something of like white supremacist groups who were like, let's chug milk because that proves that we're white or something. And they have these parties where they're chugging milk or something. Well, I have bad news for them. Because not only is it found at high frequencies in northwestern Europe, it's also found in high frequencies in parts of Western Africa and in parts of the Arabian Peninsula and northwest India and parts of Pakistan. And actually, it doesn't show up on this map because it's not a very high resolution situation here, but there's also groups in East Africa, pastoralist groups, that have really high frequencies of lactase persistence. So this is also a case of natural selection because cultures that have a long history of relying on dairying and dairy products to survive tend to have developed lactase persistence. So that encapsulates a lot of folks. Like in parts of India where the frequency isn't high, dairy products are still consumed, like paneer cheese or ghee, clarified butter. But in those things, most of the lactose is actually removed. And the same goes for like Southern Europe, Greek yogurt. Oh, well, in yogurt, there's really not very much lactose whatsoever. So, like I said, you have East African populations who practice pastoralism and have a long history of doing so. You have some populations in the Arabian Peninsula that have practiced pastoralism with camels, and populations in Europe that have practiced pastoralism for a long time. So if you want to group together people with high frequencies of lactase persistence, you're going to have some West Africans, some Europeans, some East Africans, and some folks from the Arabian Peninsula. If we want to look at another type of adaptation, there's high altitude adaptations that are shared by, like similar types of adaptations that are shared by people who live in the Himalayas and people who live in the Andes. And these are obviously groups that are pretty far away from one another, but they have adapted to similar environments in similar ways. So, for example, they may have larger chest cavities to have like bigger lungs or bigger space to fill up your lungs with air, larger hearts to more efficiently pump blood throughout your body, larger volume of red blood cells, all because the oxygen is so thin at those high altitudes. And then another trait that tends to get sort of racialized in the West is sickle cell. Sickle cell trait is another case of natural selection, believe it or not. It's something called a balanced polymorphism. Even though having sickle cell disease, especially before modern medical treatment, was, a really life-threatening condition, you only have sickle cell disease if you have two of the sickle cell alleles. If you just have one sickle cell allele and one regular blood cell allele, you actually have some protection against malaria. So that protection against malaria was strong enough, because malaria killed a lot of people, that it kept a certain frequency of the sickle cell trait in populations where malaria was endemic. So, that sickle cell trait didn't spread to super high frequency, but it was maintained at a certain balance in the population. Because if you had two, that was disadvantageous, right? And you probably weren't able to have as many children over the course of your life because of a shorter lifespan, maybe. But if you only had one, you actually had higher fitness than people with two, like normal red blood cell alleles. So this top map shows the frequency of the sickle cell trait in the world today, and it's highest in parts of Africa, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, looks like Iran, and even parts of like Greece and Southern Europe and parts of India. Those are all areas, if you look at the bottom map, where malaria is endemic and has been for a long time. There's also malarial regions in parts of the Americas, but there's different types of adaptations for that, and people haven't been in the Americas for as long, so there hasn't been as much time to sort of accumulate the types of mutations that might confer a benefit. Also, in Southern Europe, there's another type of mosquito-borne. It is malaria that has affected Southern Europe in the past, but there's another trait that spread in frequency there, and that trait can also cause a disease called thalassemia, but it's a similar kind of balanced polymorphism. So again, these areas that are not all on the same continent or all in the same country, or where people don't all have the same skin tone, they still develop high frequencies of this trait because it protected against a disease that was common to all these areas. So this right here kind of gets at the heart of it. Remember how we said that in order for race to make sense as a concept, you would have to say that people in group A, race A, are somehow more similar to each other than they are to people in race B, right? Otherwise, it's arbitrary how you're splitting up humanity, right? And you're just choosing the traits that you want to use to split people up in the way that you want to split people up, right? So there was an anthropologist, I believe this was in the 70s, who looked at genetic variation in certain traits. I don't remember specifically what he looked at, but and he looked at all of the kind of traditional populations that you would call a race. And so what he found, I'm going to kind of graphically show you an analogy of what he found. So let's say all these dots represent individuals who were tested for a number of genetic traits, and their position on the X and Y axis has to do with which specific alleles they have, and just kind of the spread of it represents overall genetic variation. The dots that are colored green, we're going to say were typically put into one race, and the dots that are colored red were typically put into another race. Okay. So what he found was when he kind of measured this, he said, all right, well, let's look at this green group. Let's look at the total amount of variation that exists, right? So you look at, individuals at opposite ends of the spectrum to see like how much variation there is within the green group, right? And there's quite a bit. Then you look, within the red group. Wow, there's a lot of variation within this group, right? Well, what about between the groups? So there's the average for the green group, right? And there's the average for the red group. And it turns out those averages are not so far apart, right? So the average genetic distance between these groups is smaller than the average genetic distance within these groups, right? Or than the total genetic distance within these groups. So if these groups were really so separate, the averages would tend to be larger than the variation within the populations, right? Like if you took two M&Ms and you put them far apart, it's obvious there's no mistaking one for the other. But if you smush it all together and then you try and figure out which is which, it's a lot more difficult, right? So there is more genetic variation within human populations, like let's say continental populations, than there is between those populations. So dividing people up into black, white, Asian, however many you want to do is it's a misnomer. Like that's an arbitrary way to classify human biological variation. It doesn't have any standalone biological meaning. It only has meaning because we give it meaning in a social sense. Okay. So what we do find, though, is that genetic distance and geographic distance tend to correlate. So on this top graph, you see geographic distance. So like, sort of between populations. So from this population to this population is something like 30,000 kilometers or something. And here you have phenotypic distance, which means like how different these individuals in these populations are from one another physically, right? And you'll see there is if you've put a best fit line in this thing, the genetic distance and the geographic distance kind of travel together. Well, that's obvious, right? Because before, the last 100 years or so, people didn't move around all that much on average, right? So even if you marry and have kids with the person in the village next to you, people in that village might have married and had kids with the people in the village next to them, et cetera, et cetera. So there is gene flow, right? But it's more like the most gene flow is between places that are closer together, right? So you would have kind of an even spread over distance, right? Like obviously, like someone from far northern Scandinavia and someone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's a huge distance. So are there going to be differences that you find? Yeah, of course, there are going to be. But someone from, say, Ethiopia and someone from, say, Italy, it's not going to be as much of a difference, right? So how much sense does it make to break people up into continental groupings or racial groupings that are roughly based on continental groupings? It doesn't make a lot of sense, if you have enough data, you can parse out like an approximation of maybe where someone's ancestors might have been from because of this genetic distance being proportional to geographic distance. So this is from a study where they looked at thousands of people from Europe and sequenced their genomes and kind of plotted the statistical variation in 2 dimensions, and they found that it correlates pretty well with geography, which is not really a shocker. Europe is it's not nearly as genetically diverse as Africa. But you can find average differences if you have enough data. So there is this correlation with geographic distance, but that is not synonymous with race in any way. It doesn't say that a continental grouping, everybody in this continental grouping is more similar to each other than they are to someone in another continental grouping. So to sum it all up, is race a thing? No. Race is not a biologically valid concept. It's an arbitrary way to divide up people that was based on historical power structures. If we're talking about biology, at best we could say it's a very arbitrary simplification and categorization of the declinal variation we see throughout the globe. So it's not very representative of how human diversity patterns across the globe. However, it is a real thing in the sense that we have made it a real thing through policy and through informal social practices. And there are obviously very real economic and health and educational disparities because of that. I'm sure you've heard talk about food deserts, and those tend to be located in places where there are more people of color. This shows like frequencies of people under age 65 with health insurance, broken down by race, ethnicity, income, et cetera, et cetera. These categories are only salient because we've made them so. And so we are turning it into a thing that matters because of how we have treated people based on these labels. So it's pretty complicated. So anyway, that is the overview. So if you take nothing away from this, please take away from this that race is not a biologically valid way to categorize people. It just, the data does not bear it out from geneticists, anthropologists, you name it. All right, so that's it for now, and I will be back next week with another rockin' video. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane, and stay anthropological. Yeah, I need to come up with a better way to end these, but I'll see you later.